This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 827 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, if you could do me a favor, if you've enjoyed this show, you've gotten something out of it over the years, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Of course, make sure you're subscribed to the show too. But leaving a rating and review helps the show grow. It really helps me out. Apple Podcasts is a great place to do it. So if you could, leave this show a rating and review. Now that that's out of the way, let's get to this week's trends. Taysom Hill was really living it up as a tight end in weeks 6 and 7. He had target shares of 17.4% and 9.4% during those 2 weeks. His route participation was around 67%. In week 8, he had a huge outing, but it wasn't as a receiver. It was as a rusher. As a receiver, with Juwan Johnson back, Hill saw his route participation fall to 40%. That was a big difference compared to week 6 and week 7. It's good that they used him so much as a rusher, but I do think that we're going to be running into the typical Taysom Hill volatility once again. Over the last 3 weeks, Breece Hall is ranked as the RB3, RB4, and RB7 in weekly PPR scoring. During this time, he's seen a 75% running back rush share in each game, and his target share per game has been 17.7%. Now, for some context with how that compares to how he started the season, from weeks 1 to 4, his running back rush share was 28 percentage points lower. His target share per game was almost 9 percentage points lower. We're seeing Breece Hall the bell cow, and it's a beautiful thing. Another running back coming off a big injury last year is Javonte Williams, and we've been seeing better usage from him over the last 2 weeks. In weeks 7 and 8, Williams averaged a running back rush share of 75%. His target share was 16.7% in both contests. That's some big news. He's given us 2 straight performances now with 12 plus PPR points. He failed to reach double digits in each of his first 5 games. And Denver's a big regression candidate. This season, just one of their 17 offensive touchdowns have come via the ground. That pass-to-rush touchdown rate of 94% is second in the NFL behind only Minnesota. It's a number that will definitely regress moving forward. That's all awesome news for Javonte Williams. The New York Jets have been unbelievably good against wide receivers this year. Only 3 wideouts have ranked in the weekly top 24 against them this year. Those 3 wideouts were Stephon Diggs, who's good at football, CeeDee Lamb, who's good at football, and A.J. Brown, who's also good at football. The Jets rank as by far the worst matchup for wideouts in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Their opponents are scoring 11 fewer wide receiver points against them than they typically score in a given game. Now, some of this is definitely due to what happened last week against the Giants, but even when you adjust for that, the Jets are still the toughest matchup for wideouts. Keep that in mind moving forward. Rhamondre Stevenson has been trending in the right direction over New England's last 3 games. He's averaged a target share per game rate of 17.9%, which is in line with what we saw in 2022. Prior to this stretch, his target share per game was just 10%. According to Fantasy Life's utilization report, which you can check out yourself for free over on fantasylife.com. But according to that report, Stevenson really hasn't been seeing substantially different route participation. What's changed is his targets per route run. It's hovered the 27% range over this 3-week period. It was in the low teens before that. Essentially, how the Patriots have been using Stevenson over the last 3 weeks, it's more in line, at least as a receiver, with what we saw in 2022. I'm not sure it keeps up, but I do think that we're bound to see better numbers from Stevenson than what we saw at the start of the year. Rashee Rice ran the second most routes for Kansas City this past week. That's great. But running the second most routes for the Chiefs, it's a lot less meaningful than if it happened on another team, because they're still rotating their wide receivers at a pretty high rate. Rice has seen his route participation stay above the 60% mark over the last 2 weeks. That's up from the 40 to 50% range that he'd been seeing prior to that. But his 60% route participation still is not ideal. That's led to Rice failing to hit higher than a 15% target share in each of his last 4 games. In my opinion, the Chiefs need to get him on the field more. He has by far the best yards per route run rate on the team at wide receiver. Now, I didn't talk about Demario Douglas on yesterday's 15 transaction show because I talked about him the week prior. But in week 8, we saw an uptick in usage. Part of that was probably due to Kendrick Bourne getting hurt in the early fourth quarter, but things have been trending this way for Douglas. Douglas has now hit a 20% target share in each of his last 2 games. His route participation over his last 2 has been 77% and 84%. The one problem that Douglas could run into is that the Patriots decide to use him like the Giants use Wan'Dale Robinson. Because in week 8, per Fantasy Life, Douglas had an average depth of target of just 2.3 yards. The week before, it was still pretty low at 7.2 yards. If he's going to be a legit fantasy producer, and he's going to have a lot of opportunity now that Kendrick Bourne tore his ACL, if he's going to be a legit producer, he's going to need to see more targets down the field. The Cardinals have legit used their running backs in totally different ways during the 3 games that James Conner's been sidelined. In week 6, we saw a pretty split backfield between Amari DeMarcado, Keontae Ingram, and there's a little bit Damian Williams sprinkled in there too. DeMarcado had the best route participation, but Ingram was used more on the ground with a 50% running back rush share. That was back in week 6. In week 7, DeMarcado, 80% snap rate, 93% running back rush share, 15% target share. He was their bell cow. So through 2 weeks, DeMarcado was the clear pass catcher in the group. He was running by far the most routes. Until week 8. In week 8, Keontae Ingram had a route participation of almost 49%. DeMarcado, 28%. This is the headache that we can run into when analyzing the usage for backup running backs. We can't just assume the backup running back is going to have the same role week in and week out. Zach Charbonnet got more work for Seattle in week 8. He saw an identical target share to Kenneth Walker, and Walker had just 3 more rush attempts. Charbonnet finished the game with a higher snap rate. He outsnapped Walker 31-24. Now, Walker was dealing with a calf injury during the week. Maybe that played a role. But Pete Carroll said that Charbonnet hasn't had a lot of opportunities, and they wanted to give him a chance to play and contribute. He later added that he, quote, gets it, and that the game comes easy to him. And then Carroll also added that Charbonnet hasn't had any problems with pass protection. Essentially, I wouldn't look into week 8 as solely an injury thing for Kenneth Walker. Now, it's not time to panic or anything, but if Sharps is on your waiver wire for whatever reason, he should be added. Sam Howell has been a QB1 this season in points per game. Among quarterbacks with more than 4 games played, Howell's the QB8 in standard fantasy points scored per game. According to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, though, Howell has faced the easiest schedule in football to start the year. According to those numbers, 5 of his 8 games have come against top 8 favorable opponents for quarterbacks. Another one was a game against the 11th ranked opponent. In his 2 bottom half matchup games, Howell scored 0.6 and 9.5 fantasy points. Moving forward, Washington has the 20th best schedule rest of season for quarterbacks. It's probably not going to be as smooth from here on out for Sam Howell. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.